The morning Edna Tull backed that trailer down my road, it was a Tuesday in late July of 1988, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter by 6 in the morning, which out here means the heat is already thinking about you before you've had your first cup of coffee. The county had been without a measurable rain since the third week of April. That's 94 days if you're keeping count, and most of us were keeping count down to the hour by then. The creek that runs along the east edge of my property had gone to a trickle you could step across in your work boots without wetting the laces, and the pastures that should have been knee-high and green in July were the color of old straw and crackled under your boots like you were walking on something that had already given up. I had been farming this ground since 1971, 17 years at that point, and I had not seen a July that looked like that one. My father had told me once, when I was young enough to still think droughts were temporary problems rather than permanent teachers, that the land in a hard year will show you things it hides in a good one. I didn't understand him then. I was starting to understand him that Tuesday morning. The trailer Edna was pulling was an old gooseneck with one bald tire and a tailgate that didn't latch right. And she had 25 Hereford Cross cows in it, all of them what the county extension office would have classified, if they were being polite, as mature range cattle. What most people would have called them is scrub cows. They were not impressive animals to look at. They were not the kind of cattle you'd see in a breed association photograph. They were medium-framed and weather-worn, and some of them had the particular angular look of animals that had been asked to do more with less for a long time. Edna herself was 63 years old that summer, and she drove the way a woman drives who has been doing it since before power steering was standard, which is to say, she was precise and she didn't waste motion. She got out of that truck and she shook my hand and she said, "I appreciate you taking them." And I told her I wasn't sure I was doing either of us a favor, and she said, "Don't sell them short before you've watched them work," and then she unloaded them and she drove away. And I stood there at my gate with 25 scrub cows looking at me through the fence like they were waiting to see what I was going to do next. I want to be honest about how I looked to my neighbors that morning. The Halverson place is 3/4 of a mile north of my gate, and Gary Halverson had already sold his cow herd in May, which at the time seemed like the sensible thing to do. Grass was going and hay prices were climbing, and a man who sold in May got prices that a man who sold in August was not going to see. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown, as diner versions do, so that by the time it got back to me through my wife Helen that evening, it had become something about a man who bought a trailer full of broke-down cattle in the middle of a drought, which was not entirely wrong, but was missing what I believed, or at least what I was hoping, was the essential point. I didn't know yet, standing at that gate on that Tuesday, whether the essential point was real or whether it was just something my grandfather had written in a notebook that I had been carrying around for 11 years without fully understanding. But I was about to spend the next 4 months finding out. Helen asked me that evening after supper how many acres we were talking about managing with 25 cows in a drought, and it was the right question. The grounded, practical question she always found when I was operating more on instinct than on arithmetic. I told her I was working with what the South Creek bottom still had, and what the brushy draws hadn't given up yet, and what the Tull lease added on the east side, and that I thought there were somewhere between 340 and 380 acres worth grazing if I was careful about where I sent them and when I moved them. She listened without interrupting, which was how she always listened, and then she said, "You need to know which of those it is, 340 or 380, before you put 25 cows on it." So the next morning I was up before 5 and I walked that ground with a notebook of my own, just a yellow legal pad folded in half and a pencil tucked in my shirt pocket. And I paced, and I looked, and I made marks. And when I came back in at 8:30 with my boots chalky with dust, I sat at the kitchen table and I worked out that I had 362 acres in the rotation I was planning, which included the south bottom and the 3 draws and the east lease, and that for 25 mature cows in a drought year, that was not generous. But it was not impossible either, if the cows did what I believed they could do. The belief I was working from was not mine originally. It was my grandfather Albert Tanner's, and it was recorded in his hand in a marbled composition notebook I had found in a wooden crate in the back of the machine shed the winter my father died, which was the winter of 1977. My father had kept the notebook in that crate with a few other of my grandfather's things, a half-used tin of bag balm, a pair of fencing pliers with AT scratched into the handle with a nail, and a folded piece of oilcloth that had some survey marks on it I never fully decoded. I had read the notebook through twice that winter, sitting in the machine shed by the light of a single drop-cord bulb with the cold coming up through the concrete floor. My grandfather had kept it as a working record, mostly terse and practical, the kind of writing a man does not for posterity, but to remind himself of something he doesn't want to forget before spring. Dates and observations and small calculations, the kind of thing that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know the ground he was describing. But there was one entry near the back of the notebook written in August of 1936, which was the year the droughts of that decade were at their worst in this part of the state, and it was different from the other entries in a way I couldn't quite explain except to say that he had written it more slowly. You could tell by the letters. It said, and I am going to quote it to you exactly because I have read it often enough that I have it without looking. The brush cattle find what the improved breeds walk past. They don't look for grass, they look for the country. There is a difference, and I believe the difference is the whole thing. He had underlined the last sentence and put a question mark after it, and then he had written, below that, in smaller letters, check the south draws in year 4 of a dry cycle. Never got back to it. My grandfather died in 1941. I am not a man who believes in messages from the dead as a general proposition, but I had been turning that note over in my mind for 11 years when Edna Tull called me in June of 1988, and when she told me she had 25 range cows she needed to place somewhere because she was losing her lease and couldn't afford to summer them on hay prices. Something in me understood that I was now in year 4 of the dry cycle she had been getting drier toward, and that this was the moment my grandfather had left that note for, even though he had never met me and never imagined it would take this particular shape. I will own that part of what drove me was stubbornness, which is not the same thing as wisdom, though in farming they can look similar from a distance. The Extension Office had come out in early June, a young agent named Somebody Davis, who had a clean clipboard and wore a Carhartt jacket that had clearly not spent a winter in a barn, and he had walked the pastures with me and shown me a chart that broke down the carrying capacity formula the way they teach it at the land-grant college. And he had told me, with the kind of careful politeness you use when you believe the other person is making an emotional rather than a rational decision, that in a drought of this severity my 362 acres had the sustainable carrying capacity of somewhere between 8 and 11 cow animal units, and that placing 25 mature cows on it was going to result in overgrazing damage that would take 3 to 4 years of recovery to undo, assuming normal precipitation returned. He said it without cruelty. He was not wrong by the formula. The formula was the problem. The formula was built around improved pasture grasses and rotationally grazed paddocks and cattle that ate what a person would expect cattle to eat, which is to say grass, and grass that was already established and already accessible and already identifiable as grass by an animal that had been bred to stand in a green paddock and graze methodically from one end to the other. The formula did not account for what my grandfather had written about in 1936, and what I was now calling, for lack of a better term, the country. The country was the brush draws and the cedar thickets and the rocky south-facing slopes and the creek margins with their stands of cottonwood and hackberry and the volunteer growth that comes up in the understory when nobody has mowed it or burned it or otherwise told it what to do. The country was everything the improved breeds walk past, and the carrying capacity formula didn't count. I had been watching it go unused for 3 summers because my commercial cows didn't have much interest in it, and I had a hypothesis, built out of one sentence in a dead man's notebook, that Edna Tull's scrub cows would. I had no data, I had no study, I had a question mark and an underlined sentence written in a drought year by a man who had watched cattle his whole life and had noticed something and had never had the chance to verify it. I was about to verify it, and I was going to do it in front of the whole county while they watched and waited to see how badly I'd miscalculated. What happened in those first 2 weeks was not dramatic in any way that would make a good story if you were telling it fast. Slow stories are the only kind I know, and this one was slower than most. I put the cows in the south bottom first because that was where the most conventional forage remained, and I watched them. I watched them the way you watch something when you are trying to learn from it rather than manage it, which requires a different kind of patience and a different kind of quiet. By the 3rd day, I noticed that 3 or 4 of the older cows were peeling off from the main group in the evenings and working their way up toward the first of the brushy draws, the one that runs northeast from the corner of the bottom pasture toward the old windmill that hadn't worked since 1983. I walked up there the following morning, early, before the heat set in, and I found where they had been working through the draw. They had been eating, not grass, or not primarily grass. They had been working through the browse layer, the low branches of the scrubby hackberry and Osage orange that grew along the draw, nipping leaves and twigs, pulling at the seed heads of the volunteer weeds that had grown up in the shade of the brush, where the sun hadn't been hot enough to burn them out. The ground in that draw had stayed 4 or 5 degrees cooler than the open pasture. I could feel it when I walked in under the canopy, and there was a faint smell of green things that had been absent from the rest of the farm since May. The cows had found it, not by my instruction, not by my rotation plan, by whatever it is an animal uses when it has been bred for country rather than for paddocks, which is something closer to hunger-shaped intuition than anything I can name more precisely than that. I went back to my grandfather's notebook that evening. I sat under the drop cord in the machine shed the way I had the winter of 1977, and I read that entry again, and I thought about the question mark, and I thought about the fact that he had written, never got back to it, in the way a man writes something he intended to return to and didn't, and I made a decision that I had been putting off since June, which was to actually map what the cows were using and what they were leaving, and to do it systematically, not because I needed to prove something to the extension agent, but because I owed it to the man who had written the note to answer the question he hadn't been able to answer himself. The mapping took me 11 days. I want to describe how I did it, because the method matters to the story. I divided the 362 acres into a grid of what I called reading blocks, each one roughly 40 acres, and I walked each block on consecutive mornings, always before 8, always with the same yellow legal pad and the same pencil, and I recorded what I found, what was being grazed, what wasn't, how deep the cattle had gone into the brush, where they had bedded, where they had watered, and where they had not been at all. I also recorded, in a separate column, what the conventional forage situation looked like in each block, meaning how much usable grass remained. The results, when I laid them all out on the kitchen table on the evening of the 11th day, were not what I expected, even having seen what the cows were doing in the first draw. What I found was that in 6 of my 9 reading blocks, the cattle were getting between 35 and 50% of their apparent daily intake from browse and non-grass forages, meaning the hackberry and Osage orange leaves, the dried seed heads of forbs and volunteer weeds, the low brushy growth along the draws and the creek margins. They were not doing this because they were starving. Their body condition, which I was scoring every 10 days, was holding at what I estimated to be a 4.5 to 5 on a 9-point scale, which for late July in a drought year on marginal ground is not a failing grade. It is a passing grade. In 2 of my 9 blocks, the draw systems were providing the majority of available forage, and the grass was essentially a supplement rather than the primary feed source. In 1 block, the northeast corner, where the creek margin was thickest, the cattle were in better condition than I'd seen them when they arrived, because the browse layer there was dense enough, and the creek had maintained enough subsurface moisture to keep the understory producing. The extension agent had told me in June that the county average for forage production in the drought year would be approximately 43% of the normal yield. He had not been counting browse. He had not been counting forbs. He had not been counting the seed heads of plants that didn't appear on the standardized forage inventory his office used. He had been counting what the formula counted, and the formula was leaving out a substantial portion of what was actually available to an animal that knew how to find it. I wrote all of this out in my legal pad, column by column, and I sat with it until Helen came in and put a cup of coffee in front of me and looked at the columns for a while without saying anything, and then she said, "That's more than you expected." And I said, "Yes, it is." And she said, "Is it enough?" And I said, "I think it might be enough if I'm careful about moving them, and if the draws keep producing at close to this rate through September." She nodded, and she went back to whatever she had been doing, and I sat there with the numbers and the notebook, and the sense that my grandfather had been right about something in 1936 and had simply run out of time to demonstrate it. The man I brought out in August was a range nutritionist from the University Extension who had been doing this work for 31 years. His name was not important to me at the time, and is not important to the story now. What was important was that he was a man who had spent 3 decades in brushy country watching what cattle ate and what they didn't, and he had the particular quality that distinguishes the long-tenured expert from the recently certified one, which is that he had been wrong enough times over 31 years to have developed a genuine respect for what he didn't know. He walked the draws with me on an August morning when the heat was already past 90 by 9 o'clock, and he was quiet the way a man is quiet when he is recalibrating. I showed him where the cows had been working the hackberry browse, showed him my grid maps and the condition scores, showed him the body condition on the cows themselves, which by then I had documented every 10 days across 6 scoring intervals. He looked at the cows for a long time without speaking. He crouched down in the 3rd draw and looked at the nipped browse line on the hackberry, how high up the branches they had been reaching, how systematically they had worked through the draw without overworking any single section of it. He turned over a piece of ground with the toe of his boot where they had been grazing and looked at the root structure of what was underneath. He stood up and he looked at my condition score records, 6 sheets of yellow legal pad, 1 per 10-day interval, 25 cows each time, all scored individually. He was quiet for a stretch that felt long enough that I started to think he was organizing a careful way to tell me I had been lucky rather than right. Then he said one word. He said, "substantial." I asked him what he meant, and he said, "the browse utilization in a drought system. I've seen it in goats, and I've seen it in some of the longhorn derivative herds, but I've not seen it to this degree in range Herefords without some selection over several generations for this kind of foraging behavior." And I said, "Edna Tull has been running cattle on rough country for 40 years without improved pasture." And he looked at the cows again and he said, "That would do it." And that was approximately the length of our technical conversation, because he was a man who understood that some things did not need to be elaborated. He wrote me a note before he left that I still have. It said that based on what he had observed, the actual effective carrying capacity of the 362 acres, accounting for browse and forb utilization by this type of cattle, was meaningfully higher than the standard formula would project, and that the cow condition data supported the hypothesis that non-grass forage was providing a significant supplement to the available grass forage during the drought period. He wrote that he had never seen this documented on a property of this scale without a controlled research design behind it, and he used the word exceptional in describing the utilization pattern in the Northeast Creek draw. I read that note twice standing in the driveway after his truck turned onto the county road, and then I folded it carefully and put it in the notebook with my grandfather's pages, because it seemed to me that it belonged there. September was dry. October was dry. The rain that finally came was a slow general soaker on the 17th of October, a Tuesday, 2 inches and 14/100ths over 3 days. And I remember standing in the doorway of the machine shed on the second morning of it, watching it come down on ground that had not seen 2 inches in a single event since the previous spring, and feeling something I can only describe as a debt being partially repaid, though I couldn't have said clearly who owed what to whom. The cows had maintained their condition through the summer. Of the 25, I had not lost one. The body condition at the final scoring in late September averaged just under 5 on the 9-point scale, meaning they had come through 4 months of drought on ground. The extension formula said couldn't sustain half of them without meaningful loss. My pastures, the grass portions, had taken damage. I will not pretend otherwise. 3 of the 9 blocks had been grazed harder than I would have liked, and the recovery work those 3 blocks needed was real and took 2 seasons to complete properly. But the draws were in better shape than I expected. The browse layer, which the formula had not counted and the cows had used heavily, is a more resilient system than close grazed grass, because the woody stems and root systems don't die back the way a grass crown does when it's been taken below its recovery threshold. The hackberry came back the following spring without incident. The Osage orange along the Northeast Creek margin was, if anything, thicker the following year than it had been, because the cows had done some pruning that let light into the lower understory. Gary Halverson came by in the first week of November after the rain, and he drove his truck to the fence and rolled down the window and looked at the cows out in the south pasture, and he looked at the draws, and he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "That's not as bad as I expected it to be." Coming from Gary Halverson in November, after watching me put 25 cows on drought ground in July, that was a substantial statement. I told him I'd had good cows, and I'd had my grandfather's help, and he nodded once and rolled the window up and drove on, and I stood at the gate and watched the dust settle behind his truck and thought about a man writing in a notebook in 1936 about cattle that find the country and about how the question mark he'd left there had taken 52 years to resolve, and about how the only reason it got resolved at all is that Edna Tull called me in June, and a woman who had been running cattle on rough ground for 40 years had bred her cows to do what my grandfather had watched cattle do in 1936, and never had time to follow up on. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That's something else my grandfather wrote, not in the notebook, but in the margin of a seed catalog my father saved, and I have thought about it more times than I can count over 50-some years of farming. The field doesn't care who believes in it. It just waits for someone patient enough to ask what it already knows. I want to close by telling you what I did with the accounting, because I am a farming man, and farming men finish the books before they call something settled. Edna Tull charged me $40 a head per month for the grazing lease on her 25 cows, which came to $1,000 a month and $2,000 across the 2 months they were on my place, late July through late September, when you account for the transition period in and out. I spent approximately $600 on supplemental mineral and 1 load of hay in mid-July during the hardest 2 weeks when the bottom pasture was at its lowest. My total cost for the summer grazing operation was $2,600. What I received in return was, first, the demonstration that my 362 acres carried 25 mature cows through a drought summer with no mortality and acceptable body condition, which told me something about the land that I would not have paid $4,600 to know from a consultant, but was glad to know from the experience. Second, my pastures in the grass portions, while damaged, recovered to 90% of their pre-drought productive capacity by the end of the second growing season, which is better than the 3 to 4 year projection the extension agent had given me for overgrazing damage, because the damage was not uniform overgrazing, but strategic use weighted toward the browse and foreblayer that the formula had not accounted for. Third, and this I did not anticipate, I sold 3 of my own commercial cows in October and replaced them with 3 of Edna's Hereford Cross heifers that she offered me at $400 apiece, which was below their market value for the condition they were in, because she wanted them on ground she trusted would use them right. And I put them into my cow herd and watched their calves for the next 6 years, and those calves had a rate of weaning weight to input cost that I have never been able to replicate in the more conventional cattle I've run since. The field doesn't care who believes in it, but the farmer who believes in the field, who is willing to sit with a dead man's question mark for 11 years and then walk it out on 11 consecutive mornings with a yellow legal pad. That farmer gets a different kind of answer than the one the formula offers. Not a louder answer, not a faster one, a truer one. If you've got rough ground you've been told can't carry what you're asking it to carry, or if you've been looking at a piece of brush country that the carrying capacity chart said to write off, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you found in the country your formula wasn't counting. And if this kind of story means something to you, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there.